I'm talking to Marlene Creates, and tell us where you are, Marlene.
I'm on the outskirts of a small town in Newfoundland, Canada called Portugal Cove. And I'm specifically in a patch of old growth boreal forest, which you see behind me. That's not some screensaver thing that I've put in behind me. Those are the actual trees. They come right up to the house. I bought the house from the people who had it built, and they had such a beautiful sensitivity to the design of the house and how it fit into the terrain. And the property, in quotes, is about 6 acres, but I'm on the edge of a 920 acre conservation zone. So this whole area is actually my studio. I'm not a studio artist. I don't work in a studio and make things. I do all my work outside, and I have done for about 40 years.
And that conservation area has the most wonderful name, and I need to know where that name comes from.
Oh, good. Well, I live on Blast Hole Pond Road, which comes from the name Blast Hole Pond, and it's the Blast Hole Pond Conservation Area. Now, there's various themes for the theories. There's various theories for the name. In fact, Blast Hole Pond River, I would call it a stream. Mm-hmm. And Blast Hole Pond itself, I would call it a lake. It's a very large lake. It's not from a quarry. There was no blasting. There is a term in the Newfoundland dialect, blasty boughs. Mm-hmm. Now, blasty boughs are when a coniferous tree dies and there's all these red needles on the branches. And if you want to if you've got a fire and you need to give it a good blast, this is what you use to get the fire going.
Right.
Now, some people say blasty boughs. They don't say blasty boughs. And you can kind of see how blast hole, it could kind of morph. So to me, it's the place where people went to collect their blasty boughs, was at Blast Hole Pond.
Makes sense. That actually, there is a lot of logic to that. I'm sure there are lots of stories out there about where the name came from, but that sounds as good as any to me. And you've lived there for what, 6 years now?
20.
Oh, 20. I'm sorry.
Yes, because my presentation.
I was assuming you're sorry.
There's 6 acres.
6 acres.
I've been here 20 years. Before that, I lived in right downtown St. John's, which is the capital city of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. I lived right downtown, and the only land I owned was the footprint of the house. It was a little townhouse. The front door opened right onto a sidewalk. So I figured if you move, you might as well make a big change if you're going to go to all that trouble.
And you've described, where you live as your studio, and that means that you have developed quite an extraordinary connection to this place, and presumably quite a complex relationship with it. And I'd love to know more about that and how that comes through in your work. I mean, it does speak very loudly in your work, but I'd love to hear it from you as a maker, what that kind of depth of relationship really has meant to you.
Oh, okay. Thanks for that question. That gives me a chance to talk about that, which it is important to me. Well, when I first moved here, the forest was like this indistinguishable blur of vegetation. I mean, it's boreal forest, so it's mostly coniferous trees, but there's also deciduous trees, birch trees, shrubs, and so on. But because I wasn't familiar with it, it was just like I say, kind of this indistinguishable blur. And as I say, I'm getting to know this place one tree at a time. Also one rock, one clump of moss, one wildflower. And it's all about spending time out in the terrain. So one of my projects is titled Larch, Spruce, Fir, Birch, Hand. in which I simply put my hand as a greeting on the trunk of a tree that I've individuated. So, I mean, there's thousands of trees in this patch of boreal forest. I could just go around and photograph my hand on any tree, but it's only the ones that I know as individuals. And I started that project in 2007. And between 2007 and 2015, I photographed my hand on 81 different trees here. So about 9 a year. And then there was a gap of a couple of years when I just did not have time to spend in the forest and get to know more trees. And then I thought, so 2 years after that, so in 2018, I thought, why don't I re-photograph my hand on the same trees after an 11-year interval? So the ones in 2007, I went around and greeted again in 2018. And then in 2019, I did the ones from 2008 and onwards like that. And so there's, in the second photograph after the 11-year interval, of course, it's quite graphic to see when they're side by side, the changes in the vegetation. Some of the trees have been blown down in hurricanes and windstorms. And so I just photographed my hand in the empty space where the tree used to be. And of course, my hand is aging. So
yeah,
there's
that's an interesting
changes in that too.
Thought about, yeah. So the passage of time is marked in a completely different way that you wouldn't first think about.
Yeah, so that's the first project that comes to mind in answering your question. I've also done videos and still photography, and I write poems. I call them site-specific poems because actually I only read them in the spots where the words arose. So you've asked me to sort of break my rule by reading one of my poems. Yeah, so and for these site-specific poems, I actually invite people to come here and I take them on sort of a poetry walk. And we stop at certain spots and I read out a poem that belongs right in the place where we're standing. And the poems are just a way to point to something that's there or something that maybe was there. And I've had a lot of different collaborators on these events. I started doing them about 15 years ago, and I've held over 40 of these events, and there's been over 900 people come on these poetry walks. So my collaborators often are natural scientists. So there's usually a theme for each of these events. So I've had a geologist, a boreal ecologist, freshwater ecologist, various natural historians, someone that works with the role of fire in the boreal forest. It turns out that fire is absolutely critical for the forest to renew itself and not become a monoculture. But I also have included various other artists who do site-specific work. So contemporary dancers who choreographed a whole dance performance in relationship to the terrain. I've had many acoustic musicians who play in relationship to the ambient sounds. The Blasphole Pond River provides a beautiful soundscape. So I'm actually going to shift this year and do these events for children, for school children, starting in May. Yeah, I can't wait to have children come here.
Absolutely. And do you think that, let's say a tree scientist, somebody who's used to thinking about specimens and growth processes and all kinds of things, do you think they come away with a new insight?
Well, that I'm a great believer in ripple effects. even if you don't know what they are, they go out there. They go out there, and you rarely ever hear. It rarely comes back to you what the ripple effect of something is. But I do think that does have. I mean, I am trying to sort of integrate the arts and the sciences, because they've been so separate in our culture. So that's part of my goal and my ambition with these events.
Well, it'll be most interesting to hear how you get on with young people, with children as well.
Yeah.
Let's see. Tell me a bit more about kind of how you got where you are now, in terms of your background as an artist, and how you kind of grew into working in this way.
Okay, well, I have to go back to the 1970s for that. I finished art school, and I stumbled around for, I don't know, maybe about 5 years, I'd say. I thought, as an artist, you're supposed to have a studio, you're supposed to make things. So I tried doing that, and it was really, really bad what I was making. And I had a studio, and at one point I did start bringing some stones into my studio and doing paper casts around the stones. And it was a lot of trouble heaving these stones around. And honestly, Richard, one day, finally, I just kind of thought, instead of bringing these stones into my studio, why don't I just take the roll of paper out to where the stones are?
Why am I doing this? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'd never heard of brand art. I'd never heard of any of that. Didn't know anything about any of that. But I did know about what I call earthworks, like Robert Smithson's spiral jetty, Michael Heiser's double negative, these big disruptions to the landscape. And I thought it was not an appropriate way to treat the land in the name of art. So in 1979, I started working directly outside with paper, which I arranged in the landscape in relationship. It was a series called Paper, Stones, and Water. So some of it was done at the seashore. They were very temporary sculptures. I call them photo landworks, because I would lay out the paper, and anything that was happening in the environment at the time, the wind or the rain, was also happening to me. So in a way, the paper represented my experience in the landscape, and I would photograph the paper, and then I'd remove it. So it was important to me not to make any change to the landscape. So I did that series. I worked a lot traveling around in the UK. I went all around Southwest England and Wales. I went over to Ireland. I went up around the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. I was really interested also at that time in the standing stones and the ancient stone circles. So I did some paper arrangements with them as well. And I went up to the Canadian Arctic, to Baffin Island. I went out to the Pacific coast of Vancouver Island. So I worked in that way from 1979 to 1985. And in the course of those trips, because I was in quite remote places and I didn't necessarily have, the maps that were available, they didn't necessarily show me what I wanted to find, some of these stone circles, for example. And I would often stop and ask directions in very rural places. And I met some incredibly elderly people who had lived in these places their whole lives. And young people had left. They'd all left to go to cities. And when I'd stop and ask these directions, fine, I'd get into conversations, and I heard some of the most amazing stories I've ever heard in my life. These people, I suppose, were quite lonely. And I was traveling around by myself. So this was wonderful company and social contact, but they would often stop and draw me a little sketch map on any scrap of paper at hand, help me find my way, which is a common thing that a person does for someone who's a visitor. And I would follow these little sketch maps. And I loved discovering the things that these people chose from their own environment as a landmark for me to find my way. Could have been a tree. It could have been anything. And I thought, wow, there's something really, really interesting in this, how people perceive their environment that they've known perhaps their whole lives, and what registers in their mind from that environment. So ever since then, I have been working with what I call memory maps in my work. So I've interviewed people. I went to Northern Labrador and interviewed the 3 main linguistic groups in Labrador, the Innu, the Inuit, and what they call settlers, now known as Métis. And I've done dozens of workshops with other people, from children right up to senior citizens. I have various versions of my memory map drawing workshops, and I've even done them here with school children. Actually, I take them on a walk, and then we come back in the house, and I give them all a piece of paper to draw a map of the walk we've just did. And these are people that were never here before in their life, so everything was new to them. And there's no 2 maps the same.
No, absolutely.
No 2 maps the same. And I just find this really, really interesting. And I'm planning to do this with the children in May too, get them to draw a memory map of their walk and find out what from the environment registered in their memories and why. Why was it? Yeah.
I do the same thing with sound, actually. So often I'll take people on a walk and then ask them to draw a sound map describing the sounds that they heard. Which is quite interesting too.
Yeah.
Well, again, every map is different, completely different.
Yeah.
So I have a ridiculous question. Your work is extraordinarily sensitive to the land. It seems very caring. It seems almost reverential. And you've been in the same place for 2 decades. And I wonder what you've learned. What have you learned about the land that surrounds you? What stands out?
Oh, I try to learn as much as I possibly can about this place, from the top of the trees to what's going on underground. I mean, I've had a mycologist actually as one of my guest collaborators on these walks. So I read a lot of nature writing. I'm a member of the local Wildflower Society. I'll never take it all in. I mean, there's so much to be learned, but
all right, I'll rephrase the question. So, because that's such a vast question. But is there anything in your that you've learned in your gut that has surprised you or taken you back in some way?
Oh, well, everything astonishes me.
Right.
So
that's a good answer.
Yeah, everything. I mean, as soon as I see a bird, I go, oh, and when there's certain wildflowers that appear in the same place every year, some of the wild orchids that we have here. Oh, as soon as I see them, oh, there you are. Yeah, it's wonderful. And then this stream, I'll call it, the Blast Hole Pond River, it is different every single day, and especially in the winter. So I did a whole documentary video poem just following the river, well, actually the little waterfall in the river, through a winter. And the formations in the ice, I just would look at them and think, how does flowing water do that? How did you do that? And So you know that video poem because we
Yeah,
had
I
it at
do indeed. Yeah,
Language, Landscape, and the Sublime because
yeah.
it's based on terms, different terms in the Newfoundland dialect for ice and snow. Yeah.
I'll
And
come back to. Sorry,
yeah. No,
I'll come,
go ahead.
I'll come
Yeah.
back to language in a minute because, but oh, well, I've completely lost the thread now. I was going to ask you something based on this, but it's gone. So I will ask you about language instead. No, I know what it was. I'm going to come back to it. I'll come back to language. You talked about winter, and I'd like to know about winter in Newfoundland.
Well,
What's it like to live in quite an extreme climate?
Well, you know what? We've hardly had any snow this winter.
Really? Wow.
Almost none. I mean, I've only had to get the driveway plowed twice, I think, the whole winter. Now, it's not over yet. You can't trust April.
True.
We've had some unbelievable blizzards in April, even.
Yeah.
But the snowdrops are starting to come up, so I'm hoping for the best. Compare this winter to 2 years ago. It is the most extreme you can possibly imagine. 2 years ago, in January month, we had what is now known as Snowmageddon.
Yeah.
We had so much snow within 24 hours that the whole city and beyond had to shut right down. Everything. We lost all our power, electricity, everything was shut, everything, even essential services. There was no way anybody could go anywhere. And it took
that happens here if we get 2 inches of snow. So how much snow was that?
I think, well, at that point, I think we had a total of accumulation of something around 12 or 14 feet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody has said like it here. Yeah.
So you two are also seeing kind of extremes, because I mean that what
Yes.
we are seeing here, and I'm always fascinated with the fact that you and I are on the same latitude.
Yeah.
If you look at the map, I don't know exactly where that is, but I know we are basically on the same latitude, but our climates couldn't be more different.
It's true. Yeah.
And that's comes down purely to the Gulf Stream.
Exactly.
But that Gulf Stream is becoming very unstable, and our climate is, we are seeing far more extremes than we would expect to see. So,
yes,
we may not be getting giant dumps of snow, but we are having periods of extraordinary rain, a lot of wind, very windy.
Wind, yes. We may not have had any snow this winter, but it's been the windiest winter I ever remember, and I can measure it by the number of trees that have been blown down here.
Sure, and you're sending it right over to us, bringing us nice cold wind. So, a lot of our prevailing wind has changed too. We've had mostly easterlies rather than the usual westerlies. So, can't blame you really entirely. So,
no, because then I have to pass the blame on to people, or not, well, the place further south and west and north from here.
This is true. This is true.
Yeah.
And what's it doing to the forest? Have you seen any changes in the forest that have sort of surprised you or would be unexpected?
Well, there definitely were a lot more trees blown down this winter than any previous winter. And also, since I've been here, there have been 3 hurricanes. 3. 2010, there was a hurricane called Hurricane Igor. 2 years later, and these all happened in the month of September. 2 years later, 2012, we had Hurricane Leslie. And then just this past September, we had Hurricane Larry. Now, when I first moved, and the hurricanes have 2 effects. They either twist the trees and they crack off. Yeah. Or the ground is so saturated with water, and our soil here is extremely thin. That's a whole other thing I can tell you about the reason why, but it has, and that's what the Grand Banks is all of our soil that got shoved by glaciers off into the ocean.
Right.
The soil is so thin, it gets saturated, and the trees can't. I mean, the tree roots here do not go down.
They go that way. Yeah.
That way. And so the trees just get completely tipped right up. The whole pancake of the root is up in the air. When I moved here, Richard, there was not one single, they're called tip ups. There was not one single tip up here. And now I can't tell you how many in the past 20 years because of these 3 hurricanes and other big windstorms. And so, yeah, I have a poem about that, but I think it might be too long as the one to read. Depends how long I should read. But anyway, yes, I have a poem about a particular tip up.
So let's go back to language, because language is clearly very important in your work, and not just kind of contemporary language, but very much the sort of language of place and the language of people and indigenous language and dialect. And I'd love to know more about your fascination with that and how it plays out in your work.
Yes. Well, there's the poems for sure. And the poems, I started writing poems because there were things that happened here that I couldn't photograph. Either I didn't have my camera with me, or it happened too quickly, or it had nothing to do with what I could see, like sounds, for example, where the main secondary sense. And so I had to turn to words to represent these experiences I had that I didn't photograph or couldn't photograph. And so I started writing some poems, and I started out writing very, very short, just sort of haiku-like poems. And I wrote them on a piece of card, and I set them up in the landscape in the spot where the poem belonged. And I photographed the poem, the actual text of the poem, right in the landscape. But then I started writing some poems that were too long to write out on a piece of card. And that's when I got the idea, oh, well, I guess I should invite people to come here and I'll read the poems out loud. So there's the poems, but there's also the work I've done with local terms for ice and snow, because I realized that was a fragile, what they call a fragile, intangible artifact. Those words were disappearing because people used them, of course, to communicate the conditions, whether the ice was safe to cross, things like that. And people are just not spending as much time outside as they used to. So this communication is diminishing. Furthermore, in 1992, the cod fishery on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland totally collapsed here in Newfoundland, and it has really not come back. So the fishing industry has diminished hugely. Well, they mostly fish crab now, and so now the crab is at risk, the quantities of crab. So, and the young people are not going into the fishery. They're not learning. I mean, the fishery was a hands-on industry. It had nothing to do with book learning. People learned the fishery and where to fish and how to fish from the previous generation. And it's a real loss of local knowledge that the young people are not going into the fishery, but they're, of course, they're all being encouraged to go to university and study other things. Anyway, so this disappearing language, and it's a very poetic, I mean, many of the terms actually are from Wessex. My own ancestors are from Wessex.
Yeah.
And immigrated to Newfoundland, and then became, I mean, they were poor landless people in Dorset mostly, and Bristol. And they came here, well, they could get land, they could take land, and then they became poor fishermen here in Newfoundland. So they went from being poor landless people in UK to poor fishermen in Newfoundland, like really, really poor. The fishermen here, well, that's a whole other thing to go into, which I won't really, but they were very suppressed by what they call the merchant class here. They weren't paid for their fish. They were given credit in the store that the merchant owned. And so it was, you know, it was not fair what went on. Anyway, So many of the words here in our local language came from Wessex and Ireland. There was a lot of people from Ireland, and a lot of those words actually disappeared in their usage over in your part of the world.
Yeah, stayed. Yeah,
stayed active here. And so actually from the Oxford English Dictionary at one point came to Newfoundland. Like Oxford English Dictionary, sort of the authority on the English language, they came to Newfoundland to hear the words that were being used here. But they had to come up with some new words here because of the ice and snow, for example. So a lot of new words got invented by the people when they were here, again, for communication. So as I say, they're very poetic to me. They're very poetic. They're also onomatopoetic. Sound like the thing, so that you can see how the word arose. And this is really interesting to me, Richard. A few years ago, I learned that some scholars had discovered a topographic connection with language, that certain words arise when people are communicating orally. In relationship to the terrain, there are certain sounds that travel better than others. And they've discovered that many languages, as their bases, come from the shape of the terrain and the ability to transmit the sound of the word according to what the terrain is.
That's really interesting.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I always thought there was some kind of topographic aspect to language, but of course I didn't study it. I only just had a sense of it, and it turns out that it's
You're
true.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, really interesting. Yeah. Good. Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Your work or what you're doing at the moment, or anything like that?
I think that's lots, Richard.
It's lots. It's great. It's lots.
That was lots. I mean, I'm going to think of things after we finish, and I have thought of a poem I would like to read.
Okay.
And it's related to a tree I lost in a hurricane.
Lovely. Okay.
But it's not the long one. It's not the one about the tip up. So I got to find it on my computer. Okay.
Fine. Yeah.
Let me just do that. Okay. The form of it is a garland cinquain, and a garland a cinquain is five lines, and it kind of goes. The rhythm of it is 2, 3, 4. In the syllables. Anyhow, you'll hear that. But the way it works is you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stanzas, and then the last stanza, you take the first line from the first stanza, the second line from the second stanza, the third line from the third stanza. So it circles around. It's called Succession in the Woods, a garland cinquain after the hurricane. Black spruce, wet, alive, till noon, then all your long years torqued, exposed in this gaping bone-white cleft. Dark trunk, your full length weighs on mountain holly and dogberry. Overhead, a new bright gap. Shade skirt you cast around on nearby younger trees, shed when four-way wind twisted your heart rot. Thick bark and bristle of branches were unaware, decay awaited hurricane's cold rain. Warm flames in my wood stove will follow silence ripped by chainsaw and weighty split axe cleaving. Black spruce, your full length weighs on nearby younger trees. Decay awaited hurricanes cleaving.
Lovely. Thank you for breaking your rule. But you see, if the tree's no longer there, then it seems like a reasonable homage, really, to the tree that was.
The thing is, it was just outside this window, so I don't feel I've, broken my.
You're not really broken your rule.
No, yeah. I'm just within a few feet of the spot.
Marlene, thank you ever so much. It's been a real pleasure, as always, to talk to you about your work, and I will look forward to seeing more of it at Sentient Performativities. And it's been a great pleasure over the years to kind of follow the work as things have changed and emerged, and it's been just lovely to chat to you. So thank you very much.
Well, Richard, thank you for being so sensitive to what I'm doing. I really appreciate it.
Okay, good. Thank you.